The Pigeon Massacre by J.P. O'Brien. Things on Sycamore Street were, at present, rather peaceful. Under the watchful gaze of the full moon, Leona Castellanos kicked a pebble up the pavement. She had spent the past several hours on a hillside bench with Rory Caldwell, where the two teenagers enjoyed a panoramic view of the sky turning from orange to purple to black, feeling each other's warmth and talking about everything and nothing until it was finally Rory who needed to remind his girlfriend of her curfew. "I'm too young for any of that Mrs. Castellanos nonsense," Leona's mother had teased him in the kitchen as she laid down the rule. "To you, I'm Violet, but Violet's rules are still the law around here, my young friend." Leona buried her face in her hands from embarrassment. Rory opted to forego a name altogether and simply answered, "Yes, ma'am." Now, walking home alone, Leona pulled up her shirt sleeve to check her watch. It was 2 minutes to 11. She considered letting those 2 minutes elapse to see if her mother actually said anything, but then she thought of Rory's respectful, if somewhat nervous, disposition in the kitchen, smiled to herself, and picked up her pace. Through the darkness ahead, Leona thought she caught a flicker of movement. She froze, squinting along the line of hedges. At first she saw nothing, but when whatever it was moved a second time, she was able to discern an orange streak above a dull strip of white. Then a pair of small white ears and a snout came into view, and between them, 2 black marbles staring right back at her. Leona dropped to a knee and held the palms of her hands skyward. "I mean you no harm, Mr. Fox," she thought. The fox shifted slightly on its legs as if preparing to bolt, but continued to observe Leona. They held each other's gaze in the moonlight until, as quickly as he had appeared, the fox dashed around a corner in a motion that reminded Leona of a flowing river. She sat back on her heels with her eyes glued to the vacant spot on the pavement. It was not the first time she had seen a fox up close, but it was certainly the first time one had acknowledged her so intensely. A wave of serenity ran down her spine until the urgency of getting home suddenly jolted her back to her feet. Darting past the final few houses to her own front gate, Leona's mind played a highlights reel of her 6 happy months living on Sycamore Street. Watching Dapper sloppily scratch the dirt up at Arbor Park, hearing her art teacher Mrs. Calhoun gush over her portfolio, kissing Rory in the tech booth in the middle of the Christmas play, touching the back of Rory's neck up on the hillside bench as the sun went down. If she were honest, most of the highlights centered on being with Rory. But a sadness weighed her down. She and her mother very seldom stayed in a home much longer than 6 months. By then, her mother would usually get restless, often right around the time she began intentionally picking silly little arguments with whomever happened to be her boyfriend. Leona would then find herself in the middle of a messy adult breakup and a hasty relocation. The last time this cycle had repeated, Leona had been so exhausted and frustrated at her mother that she had refused to take her headphones off around her for 3 whole weeks. Not long after those tempers had cooled, however, Violet got involved with Rob. He was nice enough. He seemed to know how to rein in Violet's destructive tendencies, at least. Maybe that much was good enough for Leona. Maybe her mother was maturing, she thought. Maybe they both were. Leona trotted up her front path and checked the time again. It was just a minute after 11 p.m., but she doubted her mother would be too upset over that. Through the thin curtains of the front window, she could see Violet and Rob's silhouettes watching TV, throwing their heads back in laughter. Leona kicked off her Doc Martens beside the front porch shoe rack, then slotted them in the gap between her mother's scruffy trainers and Rob's work boots. The following morning, Dom Burns slipped out of his back door in dressing gown and slippers, holding a steaming mug of coffee in one hand and a hazelnut biscotto in the other. He had worked out that there were roughly 12 minutes of peace and clarity contained within the small, gradually expanding patch of sunlight at the far end of his garden, before he would be called upon to make sure his 2 sons hadn't slept through their alarm. Strolling just in front of the Burns household at that moment were Tom and Catherine Evans, pushing a bundled-up baby James in his pram towards Arbor Park. They waved across the road to Marigold Weatherby, herself marching briskly back from the bakery with Maria Callas on her shoulder. Their whistled rendition of the C-sharp minor prelude was disrupted by a piercing shriek coming from the side of Clive Rotwood's house. "Christmas crackers!" Marigold exclaimed, exchanging a glance with the yellow canary before hurrying over to investigate. A second later, bursting out of his dilapidated pigeon shed in a flurry of feathers before slamming the wooden door behind him, came Rotwood. "Something's gotten in!" he announced to the anxious crowd of Tom, Catherine, Marigold, and baby James. Don Burns's curious head had also now appeared over the fence. "Gotten in?" Marigold inquired on everyone's behalf. Maria Callas glanced sideways at Rotwood before shuffling across to Marigold's far shoulder. "My birds! They're all ankle-tagged so I can see when one's missing. Some wretched animal has broken in and murdered one of my pigeons, in cold blood, no doubt." Tom scanned over the cracked panels all along the wall of the shed behind Rotwood. "Broken in," he agreed dryly to his wife. "Oh, let's try and steer clear of the dramatics, shall we?" said Marigold, gesturing her hands downwards. "You're sure you counted correctly?" "Don't patronize me, woman," hissed Rotwood. "Don't you think I'd know when one of my own birds is missing?" Marigold looked at the others and raised an eyebrow. On the one hand, that poor pigeon. Then again, if she were forced to spend her life locked up in a beaten-down old shed belonging to, of all people, Clive Rotwood, she'd probably be desperate for any way out too. The old lady lowered her face to the ground to conceal a smirk. Leona Castellanos, at that moment taking Dapper out for his morning pee, stopped alongside Catherine. "What's going on?" asked the teenager, removing her headphones. "What's going on?" snapped Rotwood. "Is that a massacre has taken place?" "Some animal got into his bird shed last night and ate one of his pigeons," clarified Catherine. "Destroyed one of my pigeons," corrected Rotwood, his raised voice once again riling up the already rattled birds on the caged ledges behind him. Rotwood spun around to pacify them with some kissy-faced baby talk through the bars. Marigold, Tom, and Dom all rolled their eyes, but Leona's widened at her sudden realization. She whispered a little too loudly in Catherine's ear that she had seen a fox here only the previous night. "Oh, what?" gasped Rotwood. "Well, then measures must be taken. First I'll get a gun, then I'll sit out all night, if that's what it takes. A fox, indeed. We're not safe with such vermin on the prowl. My pigeons aren't safe. Maybe I should pick up a few bear traps, too." Leona couldn't help but spit out a derisive laugh at the old man. "Are you completely insane? You can't do that." "Oh, just watch me." "He's only a poor fox, you maniac. There's honestly something the matter with you." It was at this point that Rotwood turned his sights fully onto Leona. Before retiring, he had spent a 40-year career teaching Latin and comportment in a prestigious boys' boarding school, where the number of instances of teenagers talking back to him had never once risen beyond 0. He narrowed his eyes at the girl, but she held his gaze. To the right of her sat Dapper, his bushy tail flapping under the curious eyes of baby James. Dapper was ambivalent to Rotwood's icy glare, far more interested in the paper bag in Marigold's hands. But a jagged grin came over Rotwood's face as he considered an alternative for getting under Leona's skin. "Forget the other pests. Maybe this is the culprit instead. Yes, that's right. That beast you call a dog." Leona was taken aback. "He would never do that." But Rotwood had found the weakness in Leona's armour. "You're not fooling anyone, you know. Perhaps I will be needing that gun after all." Leona's jaw dropped as a black rage flashed in front of her face, but it was quickly doused as she registered what Rotwood was threatening. Out of nowhere, despite her best efforts, emotion welled up behind her hollowing cheeks. She took off before anyone could see her tears, yanking Dapper away by his chain. News spread quickly of Rotwood and Leona's standoff, although Benn Radcliffe remained blissfully oblivious in the offices of the Beacon. He was occupied with more pressing matters, obsessively refreshing the view count for his new website of unpublished original fiction. Following his energizing reading at the Sci-Fi LitCon a few months earlier, he had been delighted to find the long-dormant motivation to share his novels returning with full force. He had spent weeks digitally typing up what he considered to be the highest quality from his dozens of boxes of dusty manuscripts, and had worked out how to post them online for his adoring, if modest, fanbase. Now, he told himself, there was nothing to do but wait. Unfortunately, the waiting had become relentless, and, if he were honest, a little disconcerting. He hit refresh again. "Thing's broken," he told himself, before slapping his hand on the desk and stomping to the kitchen in dire need of a cup of tea. As the tea bag steeped in his "I'm fluent in sarcasm" mug, his thoughts drifted back to Imelda Ellsworth, jotting notes during his reading in the small room at the back of the sci-fi litcon. How she had turned out to be an unexpected source of support for him. The angel on his shoulder he didn't realize he had needed all these years. It can only have been fate, then, that when he arrived back home from work that afternoon, there she was, poised to once again lend him a supportive ear. "Ben!" she beamed, after he greeted her over the fence and asked how her day was going. She was in matching rubber gloves and apron, scrubbing her front steps to such a brilliant sheen that the tiles focused a sharp beam of light onto Lars Gunderson's front fence on the other side of the road. "Well, feels like a bit of a war zone around here since Mr. Rotwood yelled at poor Leona Castellanos. Marigold told me Dapper ate one of his pigeons or something. How's your day going?" "Oh, it's going all right," said Ben, deciding not to involve himself in Rotwood's affairs. You haven't got a quick moment, have you? I was hoping to get some of your trademark life-altering advice." There was a bashful smile from Imelda as she removed her gloves and folded them neatly between her palms. "My advice is only garden variety, I assure you. But what's on your mind?" "The thing I'm wrestling with," said Ben, taking a seat in his neighbour's immaculate living room, "is knowing whether I'm being persistent and patient or just being stubborn. How do you know if something's just not working?" Imelda raised a thoughtful hand to her chin. Well, one can't really know for sure, but there might still be a strong feeling one way or the other. How do you think it's going?" Ben scratched his beard. He noticed Imelda watching the tiny dust particles cascade from his face down to his lap, and he crossed his legs. "Well, since I started typing up some chapters, I feel I've definitely got something. I want it to work out. Is that the same?" "Could be. I'd say if you feel things just need a little more time, then don't give up just yet." She gave a winning smile that made Ben's pulse quicken. As she poured them each a cup from the teapot, Imelda recounted her own experience letting go of something that had run its course. She had formerly been the neat and tidy correspondent on the popular daytime magazine show Mark Sprightly in the Morning, on which, for several years, she had shared tips for keeping a home as spotless as her own. But viewer interest in the segment had dwindled. The producers eventually stopped inviting her on. "The point is, I enjoyed it for a time, but I wasn't going to cling to it when it was gone. I could feel that it had reached its natural end. But in your case, I don't think anything is gone yet. Not by any means. I'm sure there's absolutely something great there if you're willing to persevere." She smiled once again, and there followed a short silence, in which Ben and Imelda each looked at each other and wondered who would speak first. In Ben's mind, there was a palpable electricity between them, and he thought fondly back to the short, if marginally awkward, hug they had shared at the convention. He found himself wondering if she ever thought about it too. But just as he was working up the courage to ask, Imelda rose to her feet and collected the empty plate from the table between them. "More biscuits?" Of course," he said. "You know me too well." While she glided into the kitchen, Ben relaxed into his seat and allowed his eyes to wander around the room. On the bookcase stood a picture frame with a photo of Imelda looking shockingly different. She must have been 10 years younger at least, with slightly messy hair, beaming with delight in a man's arms. Ben slyly looked at the kitchen door, then got up and moved towards the bookcase. He picked up the frame. In the photo, the two young lovers appeared to be getting out of a swan boat in front of a lake. There was a row of trees in the distance, and the afternoon sun appeared to be scorching. There were some wet patches on Imelda's dress and on the man's shirt, evidence of splashing. Ben thought Imelda had never looked so happy. But when she returned to find him inspecting the photo, her expression totally dropped. "Sorry," he said, at a loss for what else to say. "Just being nosy." "Oh," replied Imelda. She stood up straight and brushed her hand against her dress, as if trying to iron out the creases. As far as Ben could see, there were none. "That's fine." "A friend of yours?" asked Ben. But Imelda either didn't hear him or was simply refusing to answer. In either case, his question just hung there. "Well," Ben said eventually, clearing his throat, "I didn't mean to take up so much of your time anyway. Thanks for the tea, and I appreciate the advice. I'll keep at it, for now." He laughed at his own self-deprecation and started to move towards the door. Imelda seemed to be somewhere else entirely. As the week unfolded, there was a profound tension in the air on Sycamore Street. Ben knew he had touched upon something Imelda Ellsworth, for whatever reason, wasn't willing to discuss, and he now had two options on how to proceed. He could either give her some space to process whatever that thing was, or he could go and apologize before things got worse. Then again, he was not entirely sure what he was apologizing for. On Tuesday evening, thankfully distracted enough by this new conundrum to forget all about his unmoving hit counter, Ben got as far as Imelda's front gate. With a hand resting on the rose-coloured wood, he stopped and looked up at his neighbour's picture-book house, then down at his own scruffy button-down, which he couldn't recall so much as ironing. Perhaps it would be a mistake to inject his bumbling chaos into Imelda's perfect little world, he thought. He removed his hand from the gate and retreated unnoticed. At the same time, Leona had somehow found herself in a feud with the crotchety Rotwood and his now slightly diminished collection of pigeons. At first, she assumed he would forget all about it, until, after dumping her school bag and art folder in the hallway and taking Dapper for his sunset walk, she could feel a set of eyes following her along the pavement in front of his house. She removed her headphones and looked, but everything was still. The same time on Wednesday, she went out of her way to cross the street before arriving at Rotwood's house. This time, out of the corner of her eye, she was certain she saw his front curtain flutter. Outraged, she stopped and turned square to his front door, but again saw nothing. She let out an exasperated huff, then stomped on, pulling Dapper along by his chain. Poor Dapper didn't know what to make of it. Ben got a little further that same evening, but regrettably it felt like things were actually moving backwards. Imelda was once again in her front garden when he got home, tending to her forsythia bushes, and even went so far as to smile back when he greeted her over the fence. But it was a vacant smile. There was no warm invitation for a cup of tea or asking after the progress of his writing, so Ben limply opened his front door and moved inside without another word. On Thursday, Rotwood was standing in his open front doorway when his young nemesis approached. Leona, though trying her best to block out the world with closed eyes and Depeche Mode's greatest hits, felt his glare all the way on the opposite pavement and couldn't handle any more. "What are you staring at me for?" she yelled across the street. "I'm just looking after my property. I'm making sure you and that creature don't do us any more harm. No laws against that." "What's your problem? This is my dog, not some wild animal." "A dog indeed, ha!" was Rotwood's sneering retort. "Well, let's hope that chain you're holding does its job." Leona gazed down at the handle of the chain held loosely between her fingers. Dapper was sitting perfectly attentively on the other end of it, looking up at her. Leona felt a storm rising inside her. "The chain has nothing to do with anything," she yelled. "Even if there were no chain, Dapper would still be right next to me, not doing anything to you or your birds." Evidently satisfied with his short burst of needling, Rotwood retreated inside his house, though not before once again calling out, "Wild animal!" and slamming the door. Leona stewed in silence for a moment, on the brink of exploding in a scream, but not allowing herself to. Her evening walks with Dapper were getting less enjoyable by the day. A few seconds later, Ben emerged from his front gate. "Hi, Leona, how's it?" he began, but the enraged teenager was oblivious to his presence. He shrugged it off. There was no time to worry about that now. "Hi," Imelda said softly as she opened her front door to him. There was something unsettling and fixed in her expression, Ben noticed. He forged on anyway. I just wanted to apologize for upsetting you the other day. I feel awful, and I would never mean to cross a personal line like that. Imelda smiled brightly and used her palm to gently push up her bob. As always, there was not a hair out of place. No need for apologies, she said. There's nothing the matter. I should apologize for making you feel that way. Won't you come in? Ben was caught off guard, but managed to compose himself. Yes, absolutely. He followed her through to the living room. As he took a seat, his eyes went straight to the spot on the bookshelf where he had seen the picture. It was gone. He sat uncomfortably for a while, sipping on the unusually bland tea Imelda had provided for him, engaging with her in unsatisfying small talk. She made no reference to the picture or its absence, and Ben left feeling even more unsettled than when he had come in. By Friday, Leona felt it necessary to recruit Rory to accompany her on her walk with Dapper, although Rory suspected it was more likely she'd need to be held back than protected. Their walk gave Leona an opportunity to once again tell the story of where Dapper had come from, which pleased Rory. It was one of his favourites. It was when I was 13, Leona was saying. Mum took me on a road trip in America. It was just the two of us. She goes through phases where she wants to bond with me, and it usually happens whenever she breaks up with someone. Anyway, we were driving through Texas down a long, hot road out in the middle of nowhere, and we saw this pup in the ditch. The poor thing was close to death, and it must have been as hot as the surface of the sun out there. I made Mum pull over so we could pour some water into a cup for him. Anyway, there was no way that little guy wasn't coming home with us after that. He's been like my shadow ever since. You do seem to communicate with each other telepathically, pointed out Rory. At first I thought I was insane, but now I've got to know you, it makes total sense. Leona winked. We don't need to use words. He's my familiar. We're sort of two halves from different species or something. He owes you his life. It's more the universe teamed us up. That's the way I see it. So I guess that was always the plan, and that day by the side of the road was just when our team was always meant to form. At this point, the two teenagers found themselves in front of Rotwood's house. Leona broke off from her thoughts to face it, her stance wide like a standoff in a western. Don't antagonize him, please, begged Rory quietly. No, you see that? Asked Leona, nodding towards the front door. The curtain's just fluttered. He's out of his mind. Dapper hasn't done a thing, and he's just... I see you, announced the old man, bursting through his door, a protector at the drawbridge of his castle. We're not doing anything. Leona, let's just keep walking, insisted Rory, reaching to touch her lightly on the shoulder. She swung her elbow to knock his hand away. Dom Burns stepped out of his own front door, pretending to water the plants on his porch, but in position to keep the peace, should it be necessary. Rotwood, meanwhile, was growing redder and redder. You're irresponsible! I looked it up, you know. Coyotes eat birds. They are feral and cannot be tamed. Have you ever tried looking a little harder at things? Leona snapped. Rather than just judging them first. You'll enjoy your life more, I promise, you ridiculous windbag. Your beast massacred my pigeons. Rory could see Leona's blood boiling and nervously stepped in between them. Dapper didn't do this, you maniac, hissed Leona, leaning around Rory's outstretched arm. He's not some wild animal. He understands what's going on. She gestured towards Dapper, but out of the corner of her eye caught a thin sliver of orange in front of the hedge. Dapper made an unexpected lunge in that direction, yanking the chain forward in Leona's hand. The hoop caught on her wrist, but not before Rotwood began exclaiming that the animal was loose. This outburst did cause the chain to slip out of Leona's hand. Dapper ran over to the hedge and started sniffing. Several other neighbours, Adrian and Helena holding hands, and Lorraine Hershey returning from the old Hannibal house, had begun gathering on the pavement at the sound of the disturbance. Aha! You see? Exclaimed a vindicated Rotwood to his newfound audience. No control whatsoever! How does someone like you even have birds? Yelled Leona. You don't seem to care about animals at all. You keep them locked up all day in your busted shed. You seem to hate them. You seem to hate anything that has a heartbeat. Why don't you try loving things instead?
I don't think you're one to lecture me about that, sniped Rotwood. I wouldn't expect you or your broken family to know the slightest thing about it.
Rory's eyes widened to twice their size. Don Burns had now abandoned his watering can. He was too busy watching. All eyes turned to Leona, who could once again feel the tears welling up inside her, but rather than let them burst out, she forced them down with clenched fists and gritted teeth. As if instinctively feeling the same heartache as his human counterpart, Dapper turned square to face Rotwood, his front legs tensed and his bristled back arched. Rotwood froze. Before anyone could intervene, Dapper pounced forward towards Rotwood. The old man's skinny legs crumpled under the weight of his terror. But instead of lunging at him, Dapper darted around the obstacle and towards the pigeon shed behind him. Everyone looked up to see, long and low, a dark green lizard with a bulbous belly scuttling along the ground. Its black, beady eyes clocked the furry blur racing towards it, and it immediately slithered into the pigeon shed through a large gap between two broken wooden slats. Dapper squeezed his slender body through the gap after it. The sound of the pigeons' slapping wings and manic grunts from inside intensified as Rotwood, Leona, Rory and the other neighbours stared at the shed in petrified disbelief. Through the gaps in the broken walls they could see clouds of feathers and the hurricane of chaotic movement, like someone had just exploded a pigeon bomb. After several long seconds, the tail end of Dapper emerged between the wooden slats. He yanked his front end out and turned to face Leona. Clenched in his teeth was the strange, scaly creature, alive and writhing.
"What the heck is that?"
shouted Dom, so high-pitched he could have been mistaken for one of the Hershey girls.
A dinosaur? Guessed Adrian.
The devil! Cried Rotwood before rushing over to the shed. His pigeons inside were rattled, but otherwise no worse for wear. He leant out of the door and stared daggers at the huge lizard still flopping around in Dapper's mouth.
"Wait a second," said Rory. "But how—"
His words dried up as the colour drained from his face. Leona, meanwhile, raced towards Dapper and hooked a thumb under his collar, cautious not to get too close to the thing he had caught. She did not know whether to be impressed or horrified. Dapper simply continued to stand to attention, holding the reptilian assailant between his jaws. Rory dropped his gaze to the floor.
"It's my fault," he sighed. "I know where that thing came from. We sell Savannah monitor eggs at the Emporium, and I lost one of them. I never found out what happened to it. No one knew about it because I pretended nothing happened."
On his first day at his new job, Rory, slightly overwhelmed during Mr. Salazar's brief lunchtime absence, had accepted a delivery of the eggs, but had made the mistake of emptying the crate to count them. One of the eggs had rolled along the counter and tumbled unnoticed into the bin, and eventually made its way to the local rubbish tip. Throughout the winter, that egg had remained insulated amongst the mountains of grime and trash, and had then hatched into the lizard that was currently flailing in front of them.
"Well, someone will answer for this,"
Rotwood belted, remembering his anger and starting to jab at his phone screen, all the while scowling at Rory. Mr. Salazar answered, greeted with a barrage of incomprehensible anger over speakerphone, courtesy of Rotwood. The gist of the phone call, the confused Mr. Salazar eventually ascertained, was that an employee of his was responsible for the death of this furious man's pet, and that he, Mr. Salazar, was therefore culpable. By the end of the phone call, throughout which there had been countless staticky sighs from Mr. Salazar, Rory found that he had lost not only his recent bonus envelope of cash, which would go to reimburse Rotwood for the damages, but also his job. He agreed under Rotwood's stern, cross-armed gaze that he would finish the week while Salazar would drive over with a cage to collect the loose animal. "Sorry, son," sighed Mr. Salazar over the phone. Shortly afterwards, Violet intercepted a visibly despondent Leona and Rory on their way up to her room.
"What happened to you two? You look miserable." "Rotwood got Rory fired," explained Leona, with more than a hint of venom in her tone. "And he also said, well, it doesn't matter, but he said some things."
"People like that," Violet began, as Rob came up and stood beside her, not saying anything. "People like that usually have a lot of pain. They hate the world because they hate themselves." Leona tugged idly at her sleeve.
Yeah, well, that much is obvious. The trick is not to let them get to you. You stand your ground, and they'll leave you alone. I hope so. Violet wrapped an arm around her daughter's shoulder and squeezed. You'll see. We're tough, you and me. We're not going anywhere.
Leona looked up at her and through her scowl cracked a smile.
Thanks.
Shortly afterwards, under the disapproving stare of Robert Smith and Ian Curtis on her bedroom walls, Leona sat on the edge of the bed and patted Rory's shoulder. His head was concealed underneath his hood, while Dapper dozed on the floor beside him.
Poor lizard, lamented Rory. 6 months of survival only to get locked up again. And I can't believe I have to give my bonus back. Not to mention I don't have a job anymore. Well, if it helps, I don't know if you want to work at a place that sells exotic eggs. It's not like that, came Rory's muffled response. I think all the animals we sell deserve a chance. The people who buy from us give them good homes. What do you think's going to happen to him? She asked, starting to thumb the pages of a very worn copy of The Little Prince, retrieved from her bedside shelf. Do you think Salazar will keep him?
Rory raised his face enough for the hood to slide off the back of his head. Leona looked over to see him wrinkling his nose. She looked away again.
I know one thing, she announced. I'm never speaking to Rotwood again.
Rory looked up at her.
Yeah, are you okay?
Pfft, scoffed Leona. I'm fine.
I don't care what someone like that thinks. And I'm glad if that lizard had to get a meal, it belonged to him.
Immediately upon saying it, she regretted it. That same evening, Benn Radcliffe fixed his collar as he walked up to Imelda's front door. She answered to see her neighbour's kindly, if a little anxious, smile.
Sorry to show up unannounced, Ben began. But I wondered, if you're not doing anything this evening, you might like to pop next door and I could make us a nice home-cooked dinner. Maybe split a bottle.
Imelda didn't answer, but her wide eyes betrayed a curiosity.
I didn't mean to be so intrusive, Ben went on. I'm sorry if I crossed a line. I just don't want things to sour between us.
The two of them stood in Imelda's doorway for a moment, for long enough that Ben considered his shot to have been missed. He started to feel his feet weighing heavily against the inside of his shoes and wondered if he ought to just turn around and run. But then Imelda's shoulders relaxed and she gave an almost indiscernible nod.
Thank you, she said. Dinner sounds nice. You get started and I'll be round shortly.
She gave Ben a quick hug and went back inside her house, gently closing the door behind her. You have been listening to the By Torchlight podcast. For more, visit patreon.com/bytorchlight or search By Torchlight on Spotify and YouTube.